Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural program this afternoon on that celebrates America 250. I'm sure many of you already know Bob Wilson, a resident of the Cross Keys Village, and for those that may not know me, my name is Mike Schen, and we will be co-producing or co-presenting this program this afternoon. The program that we've actually got scheduled for today is one that's intended to introduce to you some of the stories and the details surrounding this region's involvement during the American Revolution. So this is all within the context of this South Central Pennsylvania region, composed of Adams County, York County, and bits of Cumberland County as well. Because all of them, all three of these counties during this time period, just in advance of the Revolution, are all part of the greater Lancaster County and then break off into York and in Cumberland. This was considered the frontier region of York County and Lancaster County in this early late colonial period, in advance of and even after the French and Indian War. And so to understand and gain a perspective of the environment within which our ancestors lived at this period of time, it's important to begin the story before the Revolution began to unfold, and in fact, take us back to the period immediately following the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. But as you can see here, by the time 1770s came along, the region was already ablaze with fervor. So this is our introduction to the York-Adams County in the American Revolution. And we are very happy to be here and have as our hosts Cross Keys Village. So immediately after the French and Indian War, the British found themselves in ownership of this vast global empire, and life was good from the perspective of the British, envisioning how they'll be able to capitalize on the rich resources that exist across the empire, and certainly within North America. So this was the period before problems began to develop in realization about just how the magnitude of the burden that maintaining control of North America was going to be for the British Crown. So in this period of time, here, this as being 1768, we have a lithograph that was part of a series called Scenographica Americana, where they idealize the life that will evolve for the British subjects in this new world that is free and devoid of the French. And this was all part of the process of developing further trade and further economic benefit for the empire. In terms of this region here of our South Central Pennsylvania, it's also useful to try to understand a few moments in time that help sets the stage for what follows with the revolution itself. So we'll be spending some time first setting that stage with a few brief slides about that helps to identify the timeline for things. So it's interesting to recognize that even as early as the late 17th century, the Quakers and the Mennonites are beginning to filter into the Pennsylvania region, mostly to the east. But by the time of the beginning of the 18th century, those Quakers and Mennonites and German immigrants had already made their way westward into right along the Susquehanna River to establish the town of Conestoga. And it was then later in the 1700s, early 1700s, when actually William Penn goes to the Conestoga town to actually meet with the Indians. And we have a description of William Penn that follows.
For those of you who have some background on William Penn, I think most of us do as a result of living in this state. Just a little background on the Friends. The Society of Friends arose in England about the middle of the 17th century, at a time of considerable religious commotion in the country. They were first called Quakers in derision because their religious fervor would sometimes lead them to tremble and shake in their transports. They accepted the term to describe themselves, so we usually say Quaker, not Society of Friends. Their ideals were faith without formula. In other words, they adopted no creed and believed in the controlling principle of the inner light, sort of the spirit within that guides you. Among the early members of the society were young William Penn, a man of trained intellect, gifted in speech, and a courtier in manner. He was the son of a distinguished admiral in the English Navy, and both he and his father were always on terms of intimacy and friendship with the royal family, the Stuarts. Young William became interested in emigrating to New Jersey and then decided to form a Quaker colony. He inherited a claim of 16,000 pounds due by the crown to his father for his father's services. And King Charles II, who never had much ready money in order to pay his debts, was glad to settle this account by granting Penn 40,000 square miles of land west of the Delaware River. In commemoration of Penn's father, the king gave the name to designate this vast tract of land, Pennsylvania, meaning Penn's woods, essentially.
So shortly thereafter, in the very beginning of the 18th century, we have not only villages beginning to pop up along the Susquehanna River, but the Penn family actually begins to grant license to individuals to establish fur trading posts along the river with the Indians, as well as even ferries that would take them across to the western shore. So John Harris is the first to have received that license to establish a ferry. That ferry was literally nothing more than canoes and longboats at the time. And if you are in Harrisburg, right along Front Street, you'll see a historical marker that marks the site where John Harris's fur trading post first was established. But then simultaneously, you start to see Scotch-Irish showing up through Baltimore as well as through Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And Quakers further develop their footprint in the area right along the river, with John Wright getting a patent for the land in 1726, and then later is given a patent to operate the ferry, Wright's Ferry, across the river in 1730. So We have more Scotch-Irish coming in. Finally, in 1729, Lancaster County gets established. There's enough of a call for local government and the increasing population in the interior to warrant Lancaster County being broken out of Chester County. Baltimore is growing, and here we have the Wrights Ferry being established in 1730. That was probably the most popular busy ferry crossing the river at this time, along with Harris's Ferry, feeding into the Cumberland Valley region in Cumberland County. This is a lithograph of the land along the Patuxent River that was purchased in the very, very beginning of what is now Baltimore Harbor. If anybody has the interest and has not done so before, I highly recommend a little day trip over to Columbia where you can visit the Wright Mansion right along the just a couple of blocks off of the river. It's truly a gem. Virtually all of the pieces on the interior are all period specific as well. So it's a real preview of life at that time period. So in terms of the progression of immigration and migration across Pennsylvania from east to west, it wasn't until 1736 that Penn actually purchases from the Iroquois permits to on the western bank of the Susquehanna. That would be this region here, which is Lancaster, York, Cumberland, and now Adams County. And of course, it's much later in time when further purchases that filled in the rest of what we now know as Pennsylvania took place. And of course, in the late 1700s, when the state line through with Maryland is firmly established by the drawing of the Mason-Dixon line. And simultaneous to this, we begin to see in this time period public roads being established. The Great Road to the Monocacy that goes essentially from York to down by Frederick is created. It's nothing more than a wagon road, but it's an improved road. It's a road that could accommodate wagons in lieu of just horses and walkers. We have now a third wave of Scotch-Irish in the 1740s, early 1740s. And then in the late 1740s, we have the first public road that stretches across York County, Adams County, out to what is now Caledonia and towards Chambersburg. That then became part of the Great Wagon Road that we'll talk more about it. And then in the late 1740s, in the 1750s, we begin to see more and more of the Palestinians and the Swiss Germans arriving. And it's been estimated that between these years of the 1727 to 75, in excess of 65,000 immigrants, German immigrants, made their way through Pennsylvania. And then, of course, in 1750, when York and Cumberland counties are established. So simultaneous to all of this is, of course, religions and congregations. And what was referred to as the mother churches of these various congregations began to also take root. And so the mother church for the German Reformed, organizing in 1747 down outside of Littlestown Christ Church. The mother church for the Roman Catholics coming up from Baltimore, the Conewago Chapel. That services are first recorded in 1730 with the present church, 1787. For the Scotch-Irish, the Presbyterians, the Great Conewago, along with Marsh Creek Presbyterian, both being established in the 1747, with the current church and at Hunterstown dating to 1787. The Methodists, Rock Chapel off of Oxford Road in Heidelberg, 1770s, and of course the Whites Episcopal Church, also up in Heidelberg, just off of the old Oxford Road, that being in the 1740s. All of these churches were then the churches from which other congregations were formed, and where the ministers actually have responsibilities and to serve the congregation, and were funded by the congregations. And this is a picture or collage of these various places. Littlestown, Stone Church, Methodists, Conewago, the graveyard at Weisschirp Episcopal, and then also the Presbyterian at Great Conewago. So the one thing I wanted to just point out, and why I included this slide, even though this is a bit later in time, 1790, we can begin to get an appreciation for just how many people lived in this region. Of course, 1790 being after the Revolution, that was a period of growth. So one could actually see or envision that probably during the Revolutionary period itself, these numbers might have been about 20% lower. And so you're talking still about 60 to 70,000 people in total within these three counties. Now, as I mentioned, roads started appearing, and so this is what is referred to as the Jefferson Fry map of the Great Wagon Road from Philadelphia to North Carolina. For those of you who have been watching the Ken Burns series on the American Revolution this week, you may recall this map being illustrated. And in fact, this road, which is more or less follows US 30 right out front of where we are today, was part of that great road that brought the Scotch-Irish inland to the Shenandoah Valley and populate the Appalachians. So this was a very, very busy period or time for immigration and movement into the western frontiers lands. Then, when we have the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War unfold, we see things change dramatically. And as an example, Chambersburg, which was literally on the very edge of one would refer to as a safe zone to the east and a high-risk zone to the west for Indian incursions, it went from a population of about 3,000 in 1755 to nearly 300 during the war. So people were leaving their farms, leaving their homelands, and moving eastward because of the Indian incursions that were occurring. And of course, during this time is when Braddock is mortally wounded and out when they were trying to capture Fort Duquesne. This map, though it may be a little bit difficult to see, that shows this region of of York, Cumberland, and now Adams County, is the famous 1759 Nicholas Skull map. And what's very useful about this is that it's the first map that gives good detail on the public roads that were in place at that time. This is during the French and Indian War, just post-French and Indian War period. And you see that coming out of York, which is right here, here's the Wright's Ferry with the Susquehanna. But coming out of York, we have the Great Road passing through here. We have a road up here, we have Carlisle, that has been established. Here's Harris's Ferry, and then there's a road running from Carlisle to York, and then from York to get to Philadelphia, one either could go, to get to Baltimore could either go straight south or it could take the old road here, the Great Road to the Monocacy. And where we're located is in this region. So the key here is that there were public roads, there were ways of people getting around and about, and this is all in advance of the problems that led into the revolution. And this just simply provides a timeline for the establishment of these various roads, public roads, that crisscross the country. So now let's back out a little bit. Now that we have an understanding of the setting of the region, there's a relatively large population. There are public roads. There are churches and congregations. There's industry. There are mills. Let's look at the bigger picture, and that is the things that were occurring politically between the American colonies and the Crown. 1763, that's when the French and Indian War the peace treaty is signed that officially ends the French and Indian War. And what follows, especially for all of you that have been watching the Ken Burns series and familiar with this time period, is a series of acts passed by the Parliament with the intention of raising revenue to help pay for not only the costs incurred from the French and Indian War, but also the costs for protecting this empire. The passage of all of these acts tends to enrage the colonists, including the people living in this area, as we'll see, and leading to things like the Boston Massacre and the Tea Act, which led to the Tea Party. Then this is a whole series of events that just amplify and accelerate with the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. First Continental Congress is 74, and then a whole series of hostilities, actions and hostilities that follow. So this is the backdrop for what we will now talk about with regard to York in Pennsylvania, this part of Pennsylvania. After the French and Indian War, there was no standing army by the colony of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania colony established by the Quakers, pacifists, and did not believe in open hostilities. They tried during the course of the war to maintain neutrality, but that's virtually impossible to do when violence is occurring in your own backyard, ultimately. So in 1775, the regions, the various counties begin to establish what is referred to as these associator volunteer companies. And it's the known approach to the defense, to defending your land based on what was learned and used during the French and Indian War. So then these volunteers became part of a military association. In the mid of 1775, the Provincial Assembly in Philadelphia actually gives official recognition to the associators, essentially thinking of it as, okay, the colony now agrees that we're going to have a standing militia. And what's interesting, and they're organized into battalions and such, all based on the region from which you come. So you'll find in the listings of of the men who served in these various companies and battalions, that they all one battalion or company might come from this township, another might come from this township. They were very localized. But what's interesting to see is that the age ranges are from 16 to 60 years of age. And that's verified or illustrated, excuse me, by when we were recently visiting and did a program at the Great Conewago Presbyterian Church featuring this Revolutionary War veterans, where in the cemetery you have 16-year-old boys who perished, as well as 60-some-year-old men who perished, who are Rev War veterans buried at that cemetery. And it did not take long for this structure, this military structure, to collapse, basically because it was not meeting the needs for the magnitude of the conflict, which is akin, this is in 76, 77. So the militia system is adopted. The Pennsylvania militia was established in March of 77, and it involved compulsory enrollment. And here you can see the age ranges for the militiamen. The militia companies and battalions have then, as I said, set up on a geographic basis. And it's frequently thought that if you were a member of the militia, you actually then, that meant that you served in the conflict itself. And that may not have been the case. And in fact, only in extreme cases where individuals who were required to enroll in the militia actually got sent to the battle or sent as part of a company or a battalion that was then marched to one of the battle's locations. And at most, their tours were quite short and only were of short duration. And of course, this is what we all hear about when Washington proposes to the Continental Congress the formation of a Continental Army where he can have soldiers that are not constantly coming and going. So think of the militia, being a member of the militia, as being similar to being a member of the National Guard. You may be called up, you may not be called up. So, but before the militia actually gets formed, you have in York County a response. And that response begins as early as December of 1774. Recall what was happening in the winter of 1774. This is Boston Massacre time. This is Boston Tea Party time. Things are happening in Massachusetts. And some of the initial officers went on to become important people in the history of the founding of the nation, including a local York resident, James Smith, who is a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and then Hartley, who was a first lieutenant, who then becomes a member of Congress. And at a future program, we'll be covering in more detail sort of the contributions that were made by some of these pivotal individuals, Rev War veterans, once they came home to the establishment of governments, businesses, and industry in this region. So we have a narrative also of that explains about this period of York responding.
It's interesting, we should preface this by saying that up until this moment, Lexington and Concord, the people out here in York County weren't particularly concerned about what was happening in Massachusetts. All those Townsend duties and Stamp Acts, that's all for them. But now word trickles out about Lexington and Concord, and including, before that, in 1774, the closing of the port of Boston and the suspension of all government in Massachusetts. This is something that could happen to any of the colonies. So suddenly, people here are pricking up their ears and taking notice. How can the British respond this way? And of course, what they're responding to was the dumping of the tea in the harbor. We just can't allow this sort of thing to happen. So they sent over thousands of troops. So that moves us to Lexington and Concord in April of 75. When news of Lexington and Concord reached the county seat of York, it was soon transmitted to every section of York County. A similar spirit pervaded the neighboring counties of Pennsylvania. One of the 8 Pennsylvania companies was to be recruited in York County. Each company was officered with a captain, 3 lieutenants, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, a drummer, and 68 privates. The captain, these are interesting little details here, the captain was to receive $20 per month. This is, by the way, in continental currency, which soon turned out to be worthless. But at any rate, $20 per month. The lieutenant, $13 1/3. A sergeant, $8. A corporal, $7 1/3. A drummer, the same. And privates, $6 2/3 in continental dollars, which was fundamentally worthless. All were to find their own arms and clothes, so that wasn't provided either. You found your own weapons and dressed yourself. In York County, the sturdy yeomanry of this section of Pennsylvania were ready for the emergency. At this period, there were 3 armed companies in the town of York. And as Mike mentioned earlier, where were they recruited? They were recruited in Marsh Creek. So for this time period, when you said Marsh Creek, it's what we now would call Gettysburg. So they were recruited in Marsh Creek at Gettys's Tavern. And some were from the Monaghan settlement, where Dillsburg now stands. And there was still another squad recruited in the southern part of York County from this region. These men were ready to enlist in the cause of American independency. That came to York, where the companies were organized with a man named Michael Doodle as captain, Henry Miller, first lieutenant, John Dill, second lieutenant, James Matson, third lieutenant. There are our group.
Yeah, so what this is beginning to illustrate is not only the quick response that took place in the frontier zone, which this is part of the frontier zone, but also we begin to become familiar with some of the surnames, some of the people whose ancestors, or excuse me, whose descendants still live and in this region that we're all familiar with. So in addition to the militia, we also have then the formation of the Continental Army and the response that it takes place across the colonies to help staff or provide recruits for the Continental Army. So in Pennsylvania, we have what is referred to as the Pennsylvania Line is formed. And this becomes part of the Continental Line that Washington relied upon. So in 1776, there were 6 battalions of Pennsylvania Line troops, and by 1777, they were organized within 14 regiments. Washington also proposed to the Continental Congress and was approved the formation of these, what we refer to as these flying camp soldiers. The flying camp soldiers were companies designed to be quickly deployed and redeployed. They're almost like the Special Forces Marines that we might be familiar with today. They're designed to go in. They're very skilled and quickly go in and then be reassigned to another front as needed afterwards. So we see then that some of these battalions actually become part of the flying, what is referred to as the flying camp, Washington's flying camp. And then if you have Rangers, and they even organize the wounded soldiers that came back into a corps of invalids. So what's really very apparent when one is digging into these Rev War records that exist is the sheer complexity of the organizational structures and the evolution of those organizational structures as time was going on. So you have, as a good example, you had at the very beginning the creation of the associators, then you have the creation of the militia, and then you have the calls for actual members of the Continental Forces, their various types. And all of these regiments, companies, battalions are sometimes they're given names like 1st Battalion, York County. Other times they are given names of the commander, Kitzmiller's Battalion or Miller's Battalion. I don't profess to be an expert in this field. So what I can say is that for any of you who are interested in military history, this is a rich area to explore and to understand. What's useful to know about the formation of these various battalions and the flying camps is that they were then, as we said, they're commanded by people of known and high stature. For example, Richard McAllister, who commanded the 2nd Battalion. He was the recognized founder of what we call now Hanover, or McAllisterstown. And as I mentioned, these flying camp forces were mobile military forces, but they only were drawn from the states of Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And in total, within these battalions from the area, it's envisioned that somewhere on the order of 4,600 men were actually sent off from the region as part of the York County Militia, would generally be referred to as the York County Militia. And we have a narrative that explains a little bit about the conflicts that they were a part of.
The term of enlistment, to which every one of these volunteer soldiers appended his signature before leaving York to head off towards Cambridge. The form of enlistment read, "I have this day voluntarily enlisted myself as a soldier in the American Continental Army for 1 year." It's better than militia arrangements, but it still meant that Washington was going to lose his army in a year, something to bear in mind, and have to reassign them. But unless they were sooner discharged, and I do bind myself to conform in all instances to such rules and regulations as are or shall be established for the government of said army. So that's the form they signed. According to the diary of Reverend John Roth, he was a pastor of the Moravian Church at York, sort of a missionary church, a Captain Doodle and his company attended religious services at Zion Reformed Church on the morning of July 1st, 1775. They listened to a patriotic sermon delivered by the Reverend Daniel Wagner, the pastor who enjoined them to, quote, "keep God before their eyes continually, and then they would be assured of his guidance and protection." At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, this band of 100 American patriots started out East Market Street in York on the Long March to join the army under Washington at Cambridge. There was a unit called, and Mike talked about these battalions, called Thompson's Battalion. The officers of this famous battalion of riflemen were the first, after General Washington, to receive commissions from Congress. And these patriots from Pennsylvania were the first troops who, west of the Hudson and south of Long Island, to join the American Army under the commander-in-chief at Cambridge, Massachusetts. The York Riflemen, after crossing the Susquehanna, passed through Reading and Bethlehem, reaching New York before any other Pennsylvania company, and proceeded to Boston, arriving there July 25th. At this time, there were 10,000 British regulars in Boston under Sir William Howe, and others were on their way from England. The arrival of the troops from Pennsylvania was enthusiastically received by the patriots of New England. The evidences of the fortitude and courage of these riflemen from York and their willingness to join in the struggle for liberty is shown by the following extract from a diary kept in Cambridge. This is July 28, 1775. Captain Doodle, I hope that's the way you pronounce his name. Mike and I weren't too sure. It might be Dodell, but at any rate, Doodle sounds a little... But Captain Doodle, with his company of riflemen from York, arrived at Cambridge about, this is from the diary, about 1 o'clock today, and since has made proposals to General Washington to attack the transport stationed on Charles River. He will engage to take the transport with 30 men. So what was this transport? Transport for British troops on the Charles River, right between Cambridge and Charlestown and Boston, where the British were stationed. So they just get there. These Pennsylvania boys just get there and say, hey, they're after this long journey. Let's go after that ship. Let's take it. It was extraordinary. And the general thinks it best to decline at present, but at the same time commends the spirit of Captain Doodle and his brave men, who, though just arrived after a very long march, offered to execute the plan immediately.
Right, so this illustrates that the York County militiamen marching all the way over to Boston through New York also would march by foot to Trenton, would march by foot to Long Island, would march by foot to wherever they were stationed. And they were some of the first to actually arrive. And we have further readings about the Battle of New York as well. Before getting to that, though, let's just mention that this is a little bit of a summary of the action of the York County militia with the years, across the years. And not throughout the war, they weren't always, or militia were also sort of stationed to do guard duty, if you will. And in particular, we have those that stayed nearby to help protect, with the protection of prisoners at Camp Security just outside of York, as well as others located further inland. Bob?
Yes. On July 7th, 1776, the pastor of the Moravian Church of York made the following entry in his diary. Strict orders came that all associators at this county shall hold themselves in readiness to march to the front. Well, in the following week, they left. July 17th, Yorktown seems quite deserted on account of the departure for the army of all men under 50 years of age. One young man had to leave for Jersey. Our young man had to leave for Jersey. Ernst Schlosser, the three sons of brothers Rothrock, Brinkman, John Seiter's eldest son, John Hierensen. In short, the most of the others who are 50 years of age. And notice these York men have predominantly German names. Several of our people, because the town has been so empty, have, in addition to other persons, been elected as members of the committee, that would be the Committee of Safety, with a guard given them night and day in order to maintain peace and quietness and give security against the plans of Tories. Remember, this was a civil war in this country as well. All business is prostrated. All ships are closed. How many prayers and tears will now be brought before the Lord by parents for their children, by children for their parents, and by wives for their husbands?
So as the war unfolds and the war proceeds, and even leading up to the point where Continental Congress relocates to York, York becomes, for the most part, Yorktown, as it's named at the period, is for the most part quite empty and quite devoid of commerce. And the population of the men have mostly departed. Which then gets us to probably the most well-known aspect of the York County in the Revolution, and that is the relocation of the Continental Congress to Yorktown after the fall of Philadelphia in the fall of 1777. So this is a rendition of the courthouse. It existed right within the center square at the intersections of West Market Street and I think it would probably be King Street. And it stood there until 1841. After which time, then it was torn down, and later, as part of the bicentennial, you'll see a replica of the courthouse that was constructed just on the banks of the Codorus River on East Market Street. But what's really interesting to know is that during this time period, when Continental Congress was meeting at York, this is when a number of things were transpiring that influenced the trajectory of the war overall. So at this point in time, this is when the delegates receive word of Washington's loss at Brandywine. On the other hand, it was Burgoyne's surrender up at Saratoga, the entire army that came in from the north, with the northern invasion ultimately surrendering. The troops that were taken prisoner led to the establishment of camp security and other prisoner of war camps in the interior, such as down in Winchester in the interior. But also at the same time, in consequence of the Battle of Saratoga and the capture of Burgoyne's army, that's when Franklin secures the alliance with France. And of course, then in the winter of 1777, we go to where Washington has retreated to Valley Forge. The other major outcome of this period of the Continental Congress meeting in York was the passage of the Articles of Confederation. And this imagery is of when the Continental Congress adjourned on news of the surrender of Burgoyne in New York. There's a lot to be told about the Continental Congress in York, and our friends at the York History Center will be focusing in on that in this next year. Now we kind of move to a few things that are worth mentioning that puts a wrap on today's program. First and foremost, this is a period of time when the country is learning how to behave as a nation and to act as a nation. It's also a time when it's becoming ever more apparent that the Articles of Confederation are insufficient for governing this new nation. So when the war is over and when the peace treaty is signed, uh, and soldiers return home, essentially they most have not been paid, most will not get paid, and most will actually have problems, financial problems in the years to come. So a good example of this, as Bob mentioned, not only was the currency worthless, the American dollar, but also the promissory notes that were offered by the Continental Congress to the veterans for being compensated, they too were pretty much worthless. All of this leading to the situation where veterans on returning home have debts. And those debts, they have no resources, no funds from which to pay those debts. And that comes to a head in Massachusetts with the Shays Rebellion, which it comes as, and this is Daniel Shay, a rendition of Daniel Shay, which comes as a consequence of debts accumulating and promises of compensation not being fulfilled. It wasn't until 1818 that some form of legislation occurs by James Monroe, but it had limitations, and those limitations are that you had to be a part of the Continental Army or the Continental Navy for at least 9 months, and if you were a part of any of the state forces, it did not apply. So all of the state militia this had no impact. So then 35 years after the cessation of hostilities in 1832, that's when the Pension Act is finally passed. And it incorporates all soldiers regardless of their service and from where. Now, if we go around the county, we find that there have been many efforts placed before us to identify the burial sites of the known veterans from the Revolutionary War. And that list is way too large to reproduce. If anyone would like access to that, let us know and we'll be happy to share it with you. But this just illustrates the various township cemeteries and the various borough cemeteries that for which there are recorded veterans. Now recognize that these burials, 9/10 of these burials are for the veterans after they came back from the war. This does not even attempt to cover those who were lost in battle, for which we have very few records of who they were. Now, there's also a little bit of intrigue in the area. George Washington's travels through this region are well documented and to have occurred twice during his presidency, the early years of his presidency. This is now 1791, when the country is shortly after the peace treaty, shortly after being inaugurated as the first president, he decides to go on a road trip to survey the conditions across the colonies. So as part of that spring trip of 1791, he's coming back north towards Philadelphia from the south. And of course, to go from the Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, Cumberland Valley, or even regions along the Tidewater of Virginia, you would naturally come up to Frederick, and you would naturally, one of the only public roads at that time, you would take the Great Road to the Monocacy from York to Frederick. So he comes up through, documented it through Tawnytown, Littlestown, and Hanover. He overnighted in Tawnytown on July 1st, got an early start and had breakfast in Hanover, and then on July 2nd reached Philadelphia, reached Hanover on July 2nd and then Philadelphia on July 6th. So he marches up or rides up from Frederick to Tawnytown to Hanover to York, across the Wright's Ferry, Chambersburg, and then eastward along the Pike. Some years later, of course, he gathers his troops in south of York. They assemble in Carlisle, and where they make their way in October of 1794 to the Whiskey Rebellion. After the Whiskey Rebellion, and after that threat had been pacified, he travels east across from Chambersburg, across Black's Gap, which is at the Caledonia State Park, takes the north route, passes through Hunterstown, passes through what is then Oxford Town, and continues east across the Susquehanna River. And at this point, there is this very well documented case where he overnights at Russell's Tavern just north of Gettysburg on October 24th. The less documented tale, for which there is not concrete information, is that his horse needs to stop at Tate's blacksmith shop, which is on the north side of Hunterstown, where he pauses at the stream that crosses underneath the highway to catch a fresh drink of water. Now, Thomas Jefferson also passed through this area, and this was earlier in time. This is actually during the Revolution. And first, coming in through Hanover because of, as I say, it being part of the crossroads to the south and as well as to the north and the east. So on May 12th of 1776, on his way to the Continental Congress, before July 1776, he stops and lodges at Caspar Reineker's Inn, which is called the Sign of the Horse. It was located at what is now 36 Frederick Street, right on the corner of that first alley from the square as you're passing down Frederick Street on the south side. Across the street, I've been told. Pardon me? No, the question is whether it was near McAllister's Hotel, and no, McAllister's Hotel is down off what is now Middle Street. So it's actually well documented that Caspar Reineker's property was at this corner, if you look at deed and property deeds. And it is also recorded in Thomas Jefferson's journal that he got there in time to have a local barber attend to him. Reineker's not only continues to maintain that inn and at the Sign of the Horse in Hanover, but also then is maintained or moves to Abbottstown and then ultimately passes away in Hanover. But then on his way back to Monticello after the Continental Congress on September 5th, he stays at the Sign of the Horse again. So it must have been a nice place. I made mention about the map horn, or the horn map. And this is the horn map of, this is the horn map of the George Nace. How do you pronounce it? Nace or Nace? Nace, right. The George Nace powder horn map that is in possession of part of the collection of the Hanover Historical Society. And this is just an illustration of the Hudson River powder horn map, where the horns would be engraved with the mappings of travels of the owner. So the George Nace powder horn map actually shows the location of his inn as well, of the inn. So this was our attempt to provide a bit of a snapshot that introduces everyone to the early part of the war, an overview of York County's involvement over the course of the war. We think of this as being an introduction because any one of these topics that we cover today is going to be the subject on its own of a much deeper dive and exploration of the stories behind not only the people, the families, but also the events that took place and the actual locations where these places took place. So we thank you very much for your attention and and we also have a wonderful announcement to make. The New Oxford Area Historical Society in the summer teamed up with community media and other regional historical societies, York as well as Adams County, and submitted an application for funding to produce a series of videos over the course of this year that explain in much more detail the stories involving this region immediately before, during, and after the Revolutionary War. So we're very pleased that we were chosen as one of the very few recipients to receive full funding for this project, this endeavor. We will be going out to locations. We will be visiting caretakers with their collection. We will be videoing and we will be creating a series of videos that will become available over the course of 2026. So we're very excited about this, and we hope that you'll spread the word. We have yet to launch our website for this, but stay tuned. It will be posted on the newoxfordareahistory.org. Over here, we have a brochure for the organization. You can pick it up, and it has a membership form in there. Every dollar helps us. The website is identified on the brochure. We also have at the table a few seasonal items for purchase, if you so wish. We have some wonderful, beautiful Christmas ornaments that celebrate the New Oxford Area Historical Society embossed on wood. We also have some nice miniatures of the Jacob Grassley's, right? Grass Hotel in Hunterstown. And we have some nice writing cards, note cards that with images from the region. So every dollar counts. Maybe pick up a few to give to your friends and neighbors for the holidays. And thank you very much for coming today. Any questions? Yes. Uh-huh.
Before it was split into York and Adams, you had in that area what looked like the townships at Germany, Mountjoy. When were those all named? Because I think that said it was 1763.
Is it this map?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So this is the 1759, and how do I go back to presentation? Present? No. Current. From current. Oops. Ah, there we go. I thought we were gone to the ocean. Yeah, so many of these townships, like you say, Germany, Manheim, Mount Pleasant, beyond Huntington, Tyrone. All of these were created at the time when this was still Lancaster County. So when Lancaster County was established, the entire region of Lancaster County, to the east side of the river and to the west side of the river, because York, Adams, and Cumberland were all part of Lancaster County. They were, when Lancaster County gets established in, 1729, then its job is to divide it up into townships. And these names are given at that point in time. Now, once, for example, York County is established, there's some motion and some changes in the boundaries and the creation of other townships. Maybe, and the same thing happens when Adams County is formed in 1800. As a good example of this is this area right here where we see Berwick. Okay, Berwick is the township of Berwick, but it was centered on what is now Abbottstown, but Abbottstown was called Berwick Town. And once Adams County was established in around 1830s, I think it was, Berwick was divided to form Oxford and Hamilton. So as regions became more and more populated, you would subdivide to create new entities.
Thank you.
But many of these names, that's very good, many of these names trace all the way back to when Lancaster was formed. Over here.
Hold on, I have a microphone for you. I'm getting my steps in.
Yeah, she's getting her steps in. Nope, no. Go ahead. Right here.
The microphone's here.
Did they ever find anything interesting at Camp Security?
Question is, have they found anything interesting at Camp Security? I know excavations have taken place. I'm not the authority on Camp Security. Does anyone know here the current story regarding Camp Security and what they may have discovered? It was known to have been a wooden stockade. And I think the most that they have been able to retrieve have been, debris. There's always a garbage dump, right? So you go through the garbage dump and you get some debris. But beyond that, I don't know of anything else that they've come out of Camp Security. There is a website for Camp Security, and when we launch our website, we're going to be adding a number of these locations to it. So with pointers on how to get there, how to visit it, where it's located, and then if they have their own website, we'll point you there too. But thank you for the question. Anything else?
Mike mentioned the Articles of Confederation, which were really formulated in York or Yorktown. And they were such an inefficient and bad compromise. For example, for 11 years, we were under this government. They had no power to tax. And you think, well, that's great, but what can the government do? If the federal government, in fact, had no power to tax, they had to rely on the states to come up with funding. The other thing was any legislation that was passed had to be approved unanimously by each state. So as long as Rhode Island was in the Union, they weren't going to get anything through. It was notoriously cantankerous. So it was a really sad kind of compromise that we endured it until 1787 when we created our second constitution, which is the one we live under now. One other thing, too, I just mentioned is looking through some histories of this region. There was a kind of an ethnic study that could be formulated in 1750, and I think this was still true during the Revolution, about ethnicity in this area. And I believe by the Revolution, most of the people where we are here in the New Oxford area and on towards Gettysburg were Scots-Irish. And the Scots-Irish were fiercely anti-English. They had a long and unpleasant history with the English. So they were right ready to go to war with England with great zeal and fervor. On the other hand, the closer you got to York, it became increasingly German. And York was so German that when Washington was there was an account of somebody who said he went to a service at a German church, and the whole service, he didn't expect it, was in German, so Washington couldn't understand anything that was being said. The language, lingua franca of York, was really German. And then finally, by the late 80s and 1790s, the German ethnic population began to move into this area and sort of displace the Scotch-Irish who moved on further west. So just some broader observations.
Yeah. We think that there are a number of different stories that need to be told that are valuable for people to appreciate. And so that's really the foundation for our desire or our proposal and our work for the coming year. So we're going to be busy. But if anyone has some suggestions of places that we might want to visit or aspects of this of this tale of the York Adams County in this period, please send us an email or contact either Bob or myself. And because we're formulating our work plan now, we have a good vision of what we're going to be doing, but there's still time for adaptation. And the expectation is that you'll begin to start seeing some of the products of this in the form of some of these short videos beginning in the springtime. Any questions? Thank you very much. You've been a great audience.